Mercedes AMG E55, this is the 5.4 V8. It's got the Airmatic air suspension system and it has a failure on the right hand front of the vehicle where it's completely dropped down. In this video I'm going to be showing you the step-by-step process I used to find the fault. When working on expensive vehicles, especially ones with different systems like the one we have here, Airmatic suspension, not common to an awful lot of vehicles, it can be very daunting for techs or DIY people to want to get involved in trying to do any sorts of diagnosing. And a lot of these jobs get referred on straight away and they don't even get looked at in shops. In this case, it is about simplifying the system. This is what I try to do. I try and simplify the system as much as I can, and if I can do that, I'm able to apply a methodology to be able to diagnose the fault. Ultimately, no matter if it's expensive or really cheap, if it's got an air suspension, it's going to require that air is pumped into that suspension, and it's going to need to be able to be capable of holding that air to remain upright. So if it's lowering in one corner, it needs to be able to pump in that corner, and it needs to be able to hold to stay upright. They're the two things I think of straight away when I'm looking at this fault. Now, first of all, I had no manufacturer spec information to refer to on this, and what I mean by that is I had no component locations, I had no fuse layouts, I had no suspension information like pressures or what expected values I would get. None of that in this particular vehicle, but what I did have, which was very useful, is a scan tool that was capable of reading the suspension. I was able to look at the pressures and I was able to go through step by step and just start to do comparisons when looking at the suspension. Now, even if you don't have a scan tool, if you follow to the end of this video, I do give information that you would be able to diagnose a lot of this knowing the system now without a scan tool present to you at all. So what I do first of all is I start by checking the pressures throughout the scan tool. This can be used as a comparison guide. For example, like the left hand front shock is pumped up, and therefore if I can get a pressure reading on that left hand front shock, which I do, it's nearly 8 bar, then I can safely assume, or it's logical to assume, that the right hand front should also have a similar amount of pressure. When I first checked the right hand front, it was reading 0. Now at later stages of this diagnosis, and when I was going in and out and checking pressures, it did manage to get up to 3.5 bar. But as I ran through other items on this, the central reservoir was 8 bar, and the pressure on the rear of the vehicles was balanced, so the left hand and the right hand was very similar in pressure, which was just under 4. Now, making a quick checklist for what could possibly be causing this is always a useful thing to do, whether it's a very similar fault you have or you have the exact same fault. Types of things that can cause it. The obvious one is air leaks. So the likes of the lines going to the suspension broken, connectors leaking, a split in the hose that you may not even be able to see, leaking at the compressor, leaking at the shock itself, a failure in the shock, the compressor just not capable of pumping enough air or not pumping air at all, the valve body, and that is the body where all the hoses have an assembly in, so all of them hoses join up in that body. And then on the less likely side, but possible I suppose, is the ride height sensor. Now I do rule out the ride height sensor pretty much straight away. I was getting a reading on the scan tool, and when I looked underneath, it was secured in place. It did change if you were to rock the vehicle up and down as well, so therefore I wasn't looking at the ride height sensor pretty much straight away, but the other items all were still on the list of possibilities. So the first thing you want to do with an air suspension fault is try and listen for any leaks. No more than a puncture on a tire, you can use the same method to try and source it in regards to getting a soapy type of spray and then spraying around suspected areas and seeing if you can find any bubbles coming out of it. Now in my case, this turned out to be a bit of a waste of time because one, the compressor didn't seem to be coming on and off at all when I was trying to do these tests, and I couldn't actually get the vehicle to raise from its position. At this present time when I'm doing this test, the suspension is reading 0 and the compressor is not coming on. But I decide I'm going to go straight to the compressor and I'm going to do a manual check on that. I did find access to it, which was on the left hand front of the vehicle, the passenger front. And when I got to that, I did try and get it working on and off. I could feel that the compressor wasn't coming on, so I decided I would send power directly from that compressor and then monitor the levels on the scan tool to see if I could get a pressure reading.
All right, go. Off. That's proof. That's proof right there. Now we just need to see where the leak is. Go. And again, one more. Alright.
Now having a scan tool at that point made it very easy for me to be able to pinpoint it down into the corner, and by flicking it on and off with the compressor I was able to see the pressure was coming on and off, and I was able to hear the air rushing out of the suspension on the lower part. Now spraying water around it didn't actually show a lot. I suspected it was on that rubber boot. It was coming underneath that side, and I didn't want to take any parts off until I speak with the customer. If it was my own vehicle, I probably would have cut off that rubber boot and started to spray on the underside to see if I could see exactly where it was coming from. But in any case, the shock on this had failed, and I knew it by just doing that test. Now thinking of it, if I didn't have the scan tool, what are a couple of things that we can easily do to do the exact same thing? Well, if I took the connector off the top side of the shock, I could get an air jet, and I could either, if you had one of them rubber tips or if you had a rag around the corner, you could apply the compressor air directly into it and see if you were getting any leak coming directly out of it. If you have a complete failure like I had, it would be easy to hear air rushing through out of it with a simple check like that. Now if you had a very minor leak, so let's say if the vehicle was creeping down overnight, something I thought of, you could make up like a pressure gauge, something like you would use on a coolant pressure test, where you pump it in, use the same fitting as what's on the top of the shock, and then apply pressure into it. If you were able to have a pressure gauge on it, you would know how much air you had pumped in. Therefore, you could leave it for a while and see if the pressure is being lost. If the pressure is being lost, you can safely say that the shock has a minor leak in it and it needs to be rectified. So while this is a very expensive vehicle and it's an expensive system to replace components in, ultimately the tests we'd done were quite straightforward when we thought about it. There wasn't anything really difficult in the testing process. It was just applying different logic to be able to find and source that fault. Same would go if you had an issue in the rear or if you had an issue in the lines. Applying air through different areas and blocking off one section, you would be able to pinpoint down if there was leaks in the line as well. And with that, I was able to give the customer the information that the right hand front shock needed replacing. Of course, I always advise that you replace shocks as a pair, but ultimately this was the customer's second vehicle. He hadn't actually even drove it in months, and it does very, very little mileage over a 12-month period. So for now, he's decided to put it back in the shed and he's going to do the repairs at a later date. I really hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you found it useful and informative. If you did, please like, share, comment and subscribe. And I hope to see you on the next one. Thanks for watching.